just an environmental challenge. Without appropriate action and action soon, development gains of the past decade are severely at risk, and development gains in the future will be compromised. We have 4 programs. Our biggest program is on clean technology and investing in mitigation programs in the middle-income countries. We have a program on scaling up renewable energy in low-income countries. And then we have 2 programs that I'll speak briefly about today because they look at food security the most: the pilot program for climate resilience and the forest investment program. The pilot program for climate resilience, which I'll now start calling the PPCR, aims to mainstream adaptation and action with a view to ensuring that development becomes climate resilience. The program has $1.2 billion to invest in 66 projects, and we're working in 18 low-income and small island developing states. The program works in 3 phases. The first phase, we work with a country to identify the key vulnerabilities to the impacts of climate change and the sectors most likely to be effective. We then work with the countries to undertake cross-ministerial planning, and this is very critical. The banks tend to deal with the Ministry of Planning or the Ministry of Finance, but we promote this cross-ministerial planning, and oftentimes that ministerial committee stays after the PPCR moves into the investment phase. But what we do first is to design a programmatic approach to address those vulnerabilities that have been identified with key investments and long-term programmatic goals. And then finally, we work with the MDBs to carry out the investments that the countries have identified. If you look at the PPCR portfolio, it's interesting to note the sector that has the largest share of the money is the agriculture and landscape management, followed by water resources and climate information systems and disaster risk management. Together, these 3 account for 64% of the funding, and all 3, I'm sure you can understand, are related to the agricultural sector. So it's clear with all of our clients throughout the world that agriculture and looking at food security is a key priority for how you adapt to climate change. So what are we doing with these countries? Let me give you 3 examples of projects that we're funding. One is with financial intermediaries. In Mozambique, working through local financial intermediaries, we're investing $5 million for credit lines to small and medium-scale farmers for investments such as drip irrigation and improved rainwater harvesting to increase the climate resilience of the small farmers. In Zambia, we're investing $15 million in PPCR resources to develop weather index-based insurance schemes for previously uninsured small and medium-sized farmers, strengthening their ability to protect and restore assets and livelihoods in the wake of extreme weather and climate events. And in Bangladesh, we're investing $13 million to promote resilient practices for seed selection, cropping cycles, and adaptive and efficient water management, as well as seed and post-harvest storage. Some of the key themes we're seeing across the programs is the need for climate data and hydromet services. Our pilot countries face considerable risk and vulnerability with respect to extreme weather and a changing climate, and they have all chosen to invest in increasing their capacity and infrastructure for collection, use, and dissemination of climate and weather data to enable effective planning, preparedness, and early warning, a critical dimension of agricultural productivity and of protecting lives and livelihoods of rural and smallholder farmers. We have seen the critical importance of considering gender and mainstreaming gender considerations into project and program designs is a central feature of the PPCR. This is even more important in agriculture given the unique role of women in the agricultural sector, as well as the fact that over 60% of those facing chronic hunger are women and girls. And then there's the challenge of engaging the private sector. Roger Mark mentioned that at the end of the last panel. Under the pilot program, we see in mitigation it's not difficult to engage the private sector, but in adaptation, we're finding that public sector projects account for 93% of our spending as compared with only 7% for the private sector. Remember, I said at first that we work through the private sector arms of the MDBs as well, and they're specialized in working and engaging the private sector. But we feel this low representation reflects the significant challenges associated with engaging the private sector in building climate resilience, in information and awareness gaps amongst the private sector, as well as the weak private sector and business environment in many of these low-income countries. To encourage greater engagement with the private sector, our committee set aside $70 million in a dedicated resource just to encourage a competitive bid for private sector projects. And we recently completed our first round, and out of the 6 that were chosen, 2 are related to agriculture. In Haiti, the projected climate impacts include increased frequency and intensity of extreme weather events, a downward trend in rainfall, temperature increases, reduced water resource shortages, and a rise in sea level. The recently endorsed project is seeking to secure a local supply of sorghum for production of non-alcoholic beverages while integrating considerations of climate change into the supply chain, especially at the point of post-harvest. Sorghum's a good option in terms of a climate-resilient crop because it is easy to grow, resistant to pests and weeds, tolerates soil salinity, acidity, and toxicity, and can withstand extreme tropical weather, both heat and waterlogging. Our project will support farmers to deal with the impact of climate change by implementing a menu of post-harvesting activities, including technologies and techniques for cleaning, drying, and processing crops that will take into consideration changing weather patterns, including extreme weather rain events, to develop a network of storage facilities to avoid crop loss when abnormal conditions require immediate harvesting, and to look at transport for the product from the farms to the factory, also taking into account local climate impacts and local climate needs. Another example is in San Lucia, where we're working with the Banana Trust to deliver a loan scheme to support climate-resilient agricultural investments. The project will support private actors in the agricultural sector to build climate resilience into their businesses, encourage the formation of new agricultural niche markets in San Lucia, and strengthen the current capacity and reliability of national production systems. Expected outcomes from this project are increased national food security and sustainability through enhancement of food production and investment in alternative production technologies and diversification of crops, development of new agro-processing facilities, and again, improved food storage facilities. Let me just briefly, because I think I've gone on too long, mention in the Forest Investment Program, that program is aimed at reducing deforestation and forest degradation and promoting sustainable forest management that leads to emissions reductions and enhancement of forest carbon stocks. But part of this, a major part of this program is not just to work in the forest, but to look at the drivers of deforestation, and agricultural production is clearly can be a major driver for deforestation. So in the FIP, we also have 9 projects that with explicit agricultural related investment objectives. And again, it's mostly, and I have examples, but I think I'm running out of time, to look at how you enhance agriculture on degraded lands and reduce the pressure of the forest, thereby allowing the forest to continue to be a source of mitigating climate greenhouse gas emissions. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Patricia. Being from the Caribbean myself, I was glad to hear the examples from Haiti and St. Lucia. Just one quick question. I was recently involved in an analysis looking at cross-sectoral planning in Malawi and Kenya, and very much working with the Ministry of Planning, and it's a real problem. Could you talk a little bit more about how you're working to ensure this ministerial planning across the ministries that you talk about?
Right. Well, the way our programs work is, I mentioned we work with the 5 multilateral development banks. So one of the first innovative aspects of this is we go into a country and we force the MDBs to work together. So so if you take a country, we're working in Zambia. We're not working in Malawi or Kenya for the PPCR, but we're working in Zambia, for instance. And therefore, the African Development Bank and the World Bank Group have to sit down with the government to plan how they're going to use these resources. We find that it's most effective if the lead agency is either connected to the Prime Minister's office, in the Ministry of Finance, or in the Ministry of Planning, because these are the agencies that actually have clout in these countries. But our MDBs encourage them to bring in all of the sectoral ministries, because if you identify your vulnerabilities in different sectors and you don't have the appropriate sectoral ministry, then you are not going to achieve your objectives. So that's usually done through a committee, and they meet regularly. I think one of the incentives behind this program is, first of all, these countries were resourced to do this. They were provided up to $2 million to carry out the planning phase. So that allowed them to invite outside experts, to carry out stakeholder consultations, to resource, have staff capacity to carry this forward. And they knew if they had a proper plan, there was between 50 and 75 million available for investment. So I think that carrot of actual investments, if planning were to, planning would put into place, was a major incentive for them. But I think it did, because of this money for a low-income country, that's a lot of money, it was a major incentive and brought in high-level political commitment.
Thank you. Let's now hear from Lindene, who is Lindene Patton, is the Chief Climate Product Officer of the Zurich Insurance Group Limited. Lindene.
Great, thank you very much. I've been asked to give the perspective from an insurer about food security in the face of fire, floods, and droughts. So I'll make a few comments. First off, I should disclose that I really think that issues associated with climate change and climate adaptation, especially in the context of agriculture, is a people problem, not a physical science problem. I think that we have tremendous challenges in terms of trying to determine how to best manage risks that exist in the absence of climate change, let alone managing risks that are aggravated in the face of climate change. There are many, especially those who have been working a fair amount of time in the climate change arena, who I believe started their thinking about climate adaptation and particularly management of risks in the agricultural sector, assuming that, well, when named peril risks, flood, fire, drought, manifest, this must be an insured problem, correct? So this must be generally a risk that's primarily borne by insurers. I would offer that that is a rather biased, developed market view of the world. And when it comes down to it, much more of this risk today, especially in emerging markets, but also in developed markets, is borne actually by governments. And it is borne by individuals, especially in emerging markets. And it's really important to understand where, in a macroeconomic sense, the development of an economy is, to determine what the role of insurance is and how it can play to assure economic sustainability. So the next core point I would make is that insurance is an extremely valuable economic tool. And it is a tremendously valuable economic tool in terms of achieving resilience in the core economic sense. And in the absence of insurance, when extreme weather strikes, both short-term and long-term, and basically multi-decadal negative GDP impacts can manifest. And the Bank of International Settlements did a very nice analytic looking at approximately 20,000 extreme weather events and 4,500 named storm level kinds of events, and comparing insured versus uninsured economies, looking at those impacts for multi-decadal stretches of time, and determined that uninsured and underinsured economies actually rarely recovered from large extreme weather event impacts when they were not properly insured. So this gets me to sort of the next point that I want to make, is that to the extent that this is a people problem, it's a development problem, and it is an institutional problem. And if you want to figure out how to deploy insurance to achieve the benefits that have been articulated by Bank of International Settlements and many others who recognize this from an intuitive and experiential basis, you have to figure out what insurance does. And at its core, insurance sends a risk-based price signal. It puts a price on the risk that is assumed based on the operational structure of the activity that has taken over. We do that both as by looking at historical statistics, in the actuarial sense, and we do it based on scenario building, looking at how those historical statistics and occurrences can be combined with future expectations of changes in physical science, population, and other dynamics that could impact sort of these complex systems and have an outcome. To that end, a lot of experimentation and a lot of successful deployment has been made with insurance in both developed and emerging markets to address food security and particularly agricultural security. As you know, the country in which we're having this conference has a very large risk management program associated, which involves insurance as a piece of it. It has particular characteristics. There is a lot of debate about whether there should be reform in that program or not, and this is not the place to have that debate, at least for me, for a wide variety of reasons. To the extent there are questions, I'll answer what I can. But I should disclose that we have a very significant role in that particular program. We also have significant involvement in programs in other areas for index insurance, basically insurance that says that if a certain physical manifestation occurs, an amount of rainfall, an amount of snow, a lack of rainfall, level of heat, or a level of wind, that could translate into a payout for a particular purchased insurance program. But I would point out that in terms of deploying insurance and deploying sustainability goals overall, much progress has been made in what I would call supply chains that have discretionary purchase export drivers to them, or purchase profiles that are rooted in very wealthy developed markets. To that end, in the context of ag, I would point you to cocoa, chocolate, tea. There's been extreme success in terms of deploying a multitude of solutions, including insurance as a risk management solution, to incentivize sustainable practices, long-term resilience in the face of climate change in those crop lines. The tremendous challenges present themselves in agricultural programs and products which served for domestic consumption, and those which are associated with commoditized agricultural products. Why? Because those are essentials. There's not a lot of discretionary ability to choose to pay more. People have limits on their economic budgets. So if the purpose of insurance is to send a risk-based price signal, but the purpose of a government program, an institutional program with a competing goal, which let's say might be to assure maximum revenue derivation on a global basis, or a maximum volume generation, might find itself in a position where it wants to encourage practices which are not necessarily going to result in ultimate climate resilience. It may encourage planting of crops which are not necessarily the most appropriate for the climate based on data that you might evaluate. It might encourage application of excessive inputs like nitrogen. So there are a multitude of complexities which present themselves when you have a series of products and services, and agriculture is a classic example, which are critical to the economic and social stability of a government or of a country. And so it's important from a macroeconomic perspective, when you think about how insurance can facilitate climate adaptive resilience, to understand the complexity of the system, understand whether you are operating in a marketplace or a product line which is going to be focused on domestic production, or it's going to be focused on export production, whether it is discretionary, commoditized in characteristics. All of those are going to give some information to you about how you can deploy insurance. So the challenges that we face in emerging market deployments are quite different than the ones that we face in the case of domestic or developed market deployments. In the context of emerging market deployments, there's lots and lots of discussion about microinsurance, about index insurance. But that's not what developed market people think when they think about insurance. What you think about insurance, if you're from a developed market, is indemnity insurance. You get indemnified for the loss as a result of an event where you prove up that you have been damaged in some way, shape, or form. Index insurance was generally created actually to stabilize governments, to basically provide cash flow under circumstances where a series of events were likely to destabilize the ability of that government to respond. That particular class of insurance was extended in concept to try to achieve an economic efficiency in the context of agricultural insurance in emerging markets, to basically recognize the fact that if you have a domestic consumption market where the cost basis assumes domestic pay, for lack of a better term, to be very simplistic about it, you can't. But your knowledge base is someplace where the pay rates are quite different. Trying to figure out how you can deploy that knowledge into that region is a huge development problem, which is not one that is traditionally dealt with by insurance. So there is much success which has been had, but only in circumstances where we've teamed up with NGOs. Trying to get huge scale in these contexts, we are trying to figure out how to do that. I have colleagues in the industry who've had great success in different countries, in particular through teaming. But I think the solution, both in the short and the long term for a while, is going to be trying to figure out how you can make sure you understand the complex system in which you want to deploy these solutions, how the competing institutional structures are either incentivizing or disincentivizing climate adaptation, and what trade you're going to make and how you want to use insurance. Because if you interfere with the risk-based price signal for insurance by subsidizing the insurance in such a way that people are no longer sensitive to the risks that they are creating, then you will basically undermine the functionality of insurance, which is sending a risk-based price signal. So I think there's a lot of opportunity here to use it, and I'm happy to offer more specifics. I will conclude by letting you know that it's not just about, for insurers and in the agricultural sector, it is not just about the insurance product itself, whether it's an index insurance or whether it is indemnity insurance. It's also about what we do with our portfolios. And as Patricia may be well aware, our company has been looking at and has actually recently taken action with the World Bank to offer up a bonding fund, which is designed and focused to offer capacity from our portfolio to activities and projects which meet certain characteristics to incentivize climate adaptation. And that capacity is quite broad in its character. It's $1 billion. But that's not the biggest leverage in all cases. We have to take each of the capacities for insurers and leverage them over a multitude of areas. But it's important to realize that we're kind of a multifaceted function. And I'll stop there just to leave time for questions.
Wow, thank you. Fascinating. There's a lot going on there. So I hope, I'd love to hear at some point a little bit more about sort of the teaming up with NGOs and how that has worked. So let's move on to Perry Yeatman, who's a principal at Mission Measurement.
Yes, thank you. I am a principal at Mission Measurement, but today I think what's probably more relevant is actually the 7 years I spent at Kraft Foods and the 6 years I spent at Unilever prior to that. So I would be that private sector person, that corporate voice that you all were asking about, so you can fire away and I'll do my best. I also just need to say that, let's be upfront, I am not a climate change expert, okay? That was not my background, lit major here, so it was not, don't ask me tough questions about that. But I can tell you very much about what companies are doing in the face of this. And let me start with, and I'm just gonna say our, for the simplicity here, but let me be very clear what this is. About a year ago, I stepped down as the Senior Vice President of Corporate and Government Affairs and the President of the Kraft Foods Foundation when the company split. So when I say our, I'm either referring to Kraft Foods, Inc., or I'm referring to Mondelez International, which is now the spin-out company from that firm. Neither one of which I currently work for, but I have spoken with them. They're fine with me representing the work that they're doing. And I'm delighted to be here to be able to actually share some of the great stuff and shine a light on this success that did start while I was with the company. So let's start about kind of why did adaptation and value chain even land on the radar screen? Why did it land in the C-suite? The truth is that Kraft is used to buy most of its commodities on the open market. It's not a vertically integrated company. It didn't own land. It didn't own farms. And so basically, as long as we could get the quality and the quantity and the price that we wanted, the truth is, I got to be honest, I don't think many people outside of procurement spent a heck of a lot of time worrying about where our crops came from. That really began to change. I'd like to say that it changed, about a decade ago with kind of this great social awakening in the food industry. But honestly, I think it really happened when it became a much more a business issue, which is a bottom line issue. Very few things capture the public or the attention of a public company the way bottom line impact does. And the truth was, in the mid 90s, we began to see huge price spikes, unprecedented commodity price spikes, right? These were deeply eroding margins. Shareholders were unhappy. Once it becomes a Wall Street issue, it is very clearly a C-suite issue. It is a CEO issue. Okay, so now the CEO is involved. Now, a lot of people said, gee, that's too bad. I wish it really wasn't a business driver. But the truth is, I think that's exactly what we needed in order to start taking these things seriously. And I think if it hadn't started as a mission-critical business issue, we wouldn't have gotten to go as big, to go as far, or to go as fast as we have now been able to do, mainly because it became something that it was too big to ignore. So let me just talk a little bit about, you mentioned it, it is the cocoa value chain. You all may not know, but Mondelez now, Kraft Foods, is the largest branded buyer of cocoa in the world. And we are a mainstream cocoa company. So we are trying to sell a chocolate bar for, $2, not $20 or, some other price. So so we care a lot about the price of cocoa. I'll tell you a little story. It's based on Ghana. Ghana is the second largest producer of cocoa in the world. In fact, 70% of all cocoa in the world comes from just two countries, Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire. If you actually look at the GAIN index, what you'll see is that while Ghana has been slowly increasing, I think it's now around 115 on the index, Cote d'Ivoire has been going downhill. It's now about 152, something like that. Neither one of these countries are a stellar, in a great position, right? No matter what they've been trying, they're not in a great position, and it's 70% of the world's cocoa. So we looked at our model that very clearly said we wanted to grow, we wanted to buy more cocoa, and we looked at all the competition, Nestle, Mars. I want to just give credit to them, by the way. Everybody is in this space trying to do things, so it's not just Kraft Foods and Mondelez that are active. So we all looked and we realized there was going to be a huge gap coming up in about a decade or so between the difference of available cocoa, and cocoa on the market and what we all needed to buy if our growth projections actually came to pass. And so we started looking at that. That's a real concern. And we said, okay, what is it that is driving this? Well, you look at Ghana, it was our largest cocoa market at the time. And you said, okay, so what's going on there? Well, it was really quite simple. The average age of a cocoa farmer is 58 years old in Ghana. And the number one thing, if you actually increase their yield and you gave them more money, the number one thing a cocoa farmer is basically telling their family is, don't be a cocoa farmer, right? Go to the city. So you had urbanization, you have the kind of millennial generation, you have all sorts of things in terms of resource scarcity, all of these issues coming to play. But really it was for us being seen as there was a decreased interest in village life overall and in cocoa farming as a livelihood in Ghana, the second largest cocoa producing country in the world. And I would argue, while I don't have the same depth of research, it would be the same in almost all of the major cocoa producing countries around the world, certainly in Cote d'Ivoire. So we could see the business issue, we could quantify the business issue, we could actually identify the cost differential between what would be available and what was not going to be available. So it was a business issue, and we really cared about it. So what did we do? We created a long-term, holistic, we're investing $400 million in several countries to improve or to build sustainable cocoa practices, but also to build thriving cocoa communities, right? And it's called Cocoa Life. That's the name of the program. And it has 5 prongs. Because we realized actually that any one of these prongs was not, you just heard some of the complexity, right? Every one of the prongs, if you only solve one, you're not going to get there. So you increase the yield, the first thing the person does is their kids move away. If you increase the alternate livelihoods, or you pick like any one of the various things, you have to actually do them all simultaneously. And not all of them can be done by the company, nor should be done by the company. Actually, we would argue that what we've done is put together partnership, as you said. We have a huge number of actors who are equally interested and equally invested in solving this problem, all working together. There might be 17 interventions simultaneously required for any one small village. And we might be doing 5 of them, But then we have other actors, and they might be government, they might be NGOs, they could be funding institutions, they could be other private sector groups, all of these people working together. Here's what the 5 areas are. The first is farming, right? This is all about kind of yields and plot value and best practices and teaching people about shade trees and where to plant and all of these kinds of things, that basic farming information around how do you get the best yield out of a cocoa plant, how do you maximize the value of your plot that they did not have access to. The second is around communities. Okay, even if we can get the yield up, if we don't have roads, if we don't have electric, if we don't have water, if we don't have those basic things, one, it's very hard to actually get things out of the cocoa, village, and two, people still don't want to stay in the village. 3 is livelihoods. You need it not only for the food security piece, where a lot of these alternate livelihoods are actually done by the non-cocoa farmers, so by the women and the children, but they involve things like chicken, or it'll be microfinance loans where you'd actually then have chicken and fruit and vegetables. This not only provides additional sources of income and kind of evens out the income throughout the year, but it also actually greatly improves the nutrition available in that community. The 4th one is around youth. Right? We actually had to make cocoa farming a career, something that somebody would actually choose, something that somebody could feel good about doing, could feel pride and respect, et cetera. And we had to offer, when you have these alternate sources of livelihoods, then you also have a chance to actually create jobs, right? Because now if you have electric and you have water and you have alternate sources of income, suddenly you can afford that school. Okay, so now we need a teacher. Suddenly you can afford to help put in that road. So now you actually have somebody who's working on infrastructure. There are all sorts of additional things that come from that. And then there's the environment. Obviously, without fertile soil, clean air, potable water, all of these things, again, it's not going to be, you might fix it, but it's not going to be a sustainable fix. So the Cocoa Life program that Mondelez is funding and leading engages in all of these 5 things in order to truly build thriving cocoa communities that will then therefore continue, that will make more cocoa available on the world supply, okay? So what have we learned? What would be the advice that we would have for others in doing this work? And I hope you have some understanding of what the work is based on my description. So the one thing we would say, first of all, is it has to be a mission-critical business issue, okay? For me, for us, this is not CSR. Forget CSR. I ran the corporate foundation. The foundation would never have had $400 million to put into saving cocoa farming in Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, Dominican Republic, Indonesia, et cetera else. The cocoa category, the business had it, but not the foundation. So this is a business issue, and we basically made judgments based on it's big to us, and we're big to it. If you're the largest branded buyer of cocoa in the world, you obviously have a stake in the future of cocoa. So it worked that way. There was a reason for us to get engaged. The second thing is we would say that the solutions must be holistic. We've talked about that. They must be market-based. Okay, we really believe in the operation of the market. There has to be a dynamic of buying and selling, of supply and demand, et cetera. It's not a handout. There is something that lets it keep going, and there is economic value created in this system. Market-based. Long-term, these things, it's at least a 10-year program. It's probably a generation before we can really fix it. And the other thing I would say that's very, very important is that it needs to be about partnership, not ownership. People ask us, in Ghana, that example I gave you, we don't buy cocoa directly. You can't buy cocoa directly from individual cocoa farms. It all goes through the cocoa board. So people ask us, well, then how do you get the benefit, or why would you do this? Well, our view is we didn't want to go into the cocoa farming business, right? Cocoa is one of those crops where it is almost all smallholder farmers. It has, resisted commercialization. You can only grow cocoa beans in certain parts of the world, and we're not in the farming business. That's not our area of expertise. So we believe it is about partnership and community empowerment and about putting the farmer at the center, as opposed to trying to own and vertically integrate, which is another option, but it was not an option that we felt was the right option. Okay, so that's the second piece. The third piece of advice is focusing on ag supply, and specifically on smallholder farmers. I would argue, one of the questions people ask is, where's the greatest bang for the buck? I would tell you, this is it. There's a reason everybody's excited about. One, as you said, you can make it work. But I would say there's 2 other reasons that it really matters. One is, for us at least, it was all about, these are the people that grow the crops that we need. if you looked at the total impact of craft, not only just almost everything we produce is a raw material that comes out of the ground, right? Almost everything we need comes out of the ground or on a tree or wherever else. But in addition to that, another thing to really think about, when we did the research and looked at the total impact of land, air, water in the world on craft, from field all the way to post-consumer use, we thought we were going to see a lot in terms of post-consumer. We were going to see a lot in manufacturing, et cetera. Order of magnitude, 70% of our impact in the world happened in the field. It happened in things we did not own, we did not directly control, and we recognize, therefore, if we wanted to reduce our impact in the negatives and increase our impact in the positives, we were going to have to go into the field. So it was a principle I would tell you is that it's very important. You know, we're going after the crops where we don't have a business without those crops. You cannot sell chocolate bars without chocolate. The second is, the other win about smallholder farmers in the ag supply is that they make up a huge percentage of the people in the world that actually are struggling in poverty today, and they happen to live in the countries that are often struggling the most. As I cited, you know, Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire being two examples, but you could also look at, you know, Indonesia and other places that have come a long way, but still are clearly have a long way to go. And then the last thing I think it's really important is, why would I say this is the biggest bang for the buck that we could get if we were going to invest anywhere? It is because we can make a difference, because there actually are models that work, and those models are scalable, and they are also transferable. They are transferable to other crops. We also do work in coffee, we do work in cashews, et cetera, and they are also transferable in other markets. So you're not going to have the same exact answer, you know, replicated, but a lot of the key learnings will go around the world. So that's something that the corporate sector is doing. I think it is a way that we are adapting the value chain by working in partnership and addressing all of the various things that are happening in the world that are having this impact on our ability to get the raw ingredients, raw materials that we need in order to make our products. So I hope that was helpful.
Thank you very much, Perry. I like the practical dimension of what you were sharing. You know, you can't sell chocolate bars without chocolate.
Yeah.
No.
And I love chocolate.
Yeah. So, David, you wanted to go last. You have a big act to follow. So, David Gustafson is a Senior Fellow for Environment and Agricultural Policy Modeling Lead at Monsanto. David?
Thanks very much, Roger, and I'd like to thank Joyce for the invite as well, and I'm really honored to be part of such a obviously distinguished panel, and I'll try to be brief. As was mentioned, I'm at Monsanto Company. I've actually been there since 1985, seen the company go through a lot of changes. When I joined, it was essentially a specialty chemicals company. It then became primarily a seed and trait company, as we call it. But now, most recently, it's actually transforming yet again into becoming sort of an IT company and actually a biologicals company. As some of you may have heard, yesterday announced a major new alliance with Novozymes. I'm a chemical engineer by training, full disclosure, a scientist, but I first began studying climate change back in 2007. When our board of directors asked our leading scientists whether or not this whole theory of man-made global warming was for real and whether or not it was really going to impact ag. Monsanto's obviously an ag company, and whether it was, what it really meant for us long term. And I'll confess, I was actually just a tad bit skeptical when I started looking at this, but I very quickly became convinced that this was a very real issue. We invited a number of experts to Monsanto that helped teach us about this, and I actually spent quite a lot of time with Stephen Schneider, who is now deceased, obviously, but then at Stanford, who explained to me that even though you can't predict the weather 4 days in the future because it's an initial value problem, he explained that mathematically speaking, you can predict the climate 40 years in the future because it's a boundary value problem, and he explained this all to me. But since then, along with Lindene, actually, I'm on the National Climate Assessment Panel with Don Webbles at University of Illinois, and I told that story to him, and he said, "Oh, Stephen is oversimplifying it. It's actually more complicated." But nevertheless, hopefully it was right. So bringing it all back to farming, I mean, farming has always been hard. In fact, Genesis, the first book of the Bible, says that Adam will work the ground by the sweat of his brow, and he was warned that it would yield only thorns and thistles, and it's still yielding those thorns and thistles, but it's actually getting even more difficult as we look to the future, because not only do we have man-made global warming, but we also have accelerating demand, the urbanization phenomenon that was described earlier, and this is all combining to create what I call X-farming. In other words, dealing with the extreme weather that we're facing, but also that accelerating demand. And what this is really forcing us to do as a company is to enter into partnerships. And partnerships have already been mentioned, but I think, it's very clear that we're all in this together, literally, and the only way we're going to be successful is to begin to work together. And so I'm going to shift gears just a little bit now and talk about one of the other hats I wear, which is actually as part of the International Life Sciences Institute, which is based here in D.C., the Research Foundation. We've recently launched a center called CIMSANS, which is the Center for Integrated Modeling of Sustainable Ag and Nutrition Security. And we're using integrated modeling to help improve science and public policy around the impacts of climate change and resource scarcity on nutrition security. And our focus there is really on the entire global food system and a consideration of not just the agricultural or production part of the food system, but also post-harvest losses, waste, distribution, overconsumption patterns. If you look at the whole planet, there's roughly 7 billion of us. Around 1 billion have insufficient calories and insufficient nutrients. There's another 2 billion that are okay on calorie consumption but are still low on nutrients. Roughly 3 billion are about where they need to be on both calories and nutrition. But there's another 2 billion, and I think a large number here in the U.S., unfortunately, who are over-consuming both calories and nutrition. So on a global basis, we probably are pretty close on calories, maybe even still a little bit short on nutrition, but we're not distributing it correctly. And so there really is new work, new partnerships that need to be entered into in order to solve that problem and more equitably distribute the food that we have. So in the CIMSANS Center, we actually have 3 working groups right now, one on open agricultural data, and I'm actually happy to report that Mondelez is one of the supporters of that effort. We are launching a pilot this year that's operating in both Ghana and India, and it's all about open ag data. So we're trying to create a platform with collaborators at Purdue, East Anglia, and also IFPRI here in Washington, D.C., to make data available that's relevant to the issues that we're talking about, freely available on a website, and actual tools to not only see the data, but also run some simple models to do some what-if scenarios to help improve just the overall transparency of the science behind some of the modeling that's done to make the projections that are used to drive public and private sector decisions. The other groups that we have are an improved modeling work group, but also a nutrition security working group. And on that last topic, we have a white paper entitled Sustainable Nutrition Security, a key component of food security, which you should be expecting to see in early 2014. The other thing we're doing there is hosting conferences around the world. We recently had one in Bangalore, which was on the topic of climate change impacts on water resources and nutrition security in India, which, for those of you who don't know, is currently using a very large amount of groundwater to help meet the nation's food demands. And there are real questions around the sustainability of the use of that groundwater, and that conference was helping to bring those issues to light. So one of the specific questions that we had that I am going to attempt to answer here is which countries really need the most help around the world? My answer there was really sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, which I think is no surprise here, but certainly that's our conclusion. We have entered into a large partnership in Africa, the Water Efficient Maize for Africa project, or WEMA, that has now become the largest corn breeding program in the entire continent, and that has been done in partnership with the Gates Foundation, and we're really happy to be part of that. As for the countries or areas that are going to benefit from climate change, again, it's sort of a case of the rich get richer. I think the Americas are already sort of the breadbasket of the world, and I think climate and other factors are going to favor the Americas and possibly Eastern Europe as well. As for technologies and processes that are important for adaptation, the ones that I would identify would be sustainable intensification, making the best use of the land that's already in cropland production, but making sure that we intensify that in a very sustainable manner. Water. I believe that tremendous investments are needed in water infrastructure, including here in the U.S., where we're getting much, much higher rainfall amounts in the spring as a result of climate change, and then more frequent droughts in the summertime, and we need to come up with infrastructure systems that will help store that water and make it available later in the season, and I think there's a huge investment need there. Nitrogen has already been mentioned. I think there's a huge need for new technologies to help improve our utilization of nitrogen to meet global nutrition security demand. And then new technologies, such as the ones I've already mentioned, IT and biologicals, we think are new technologies that can help here as well. As for how climate change will impact companies like Monsanto, the food and ag sector, I think in general, these companies are well positioned to deal with climate change. And in fact, I think an overall mega trend here is that their relative value will probably increase as demand increases. I think the GAIN index, in answer to another question, is an extremely valuable tool for helping to direct companies like ours and Mondelez Craft, et cetera, and others to know where in the world they ought to be operating to make the biggest difference. And then lastly, I was asked to just make some brief comments about the Climate Corp acquisition that took place recently, but certainly the view within the company is that there's an awful lot of data that are being collected, especially here in the U.S., but also globally, and farmers are just swimming in data, but they don't have actionable information. Yep. And so I think there is a huge need to change and transform that data into actionable information and positively influence decisions in order to help farmers make better use of their resources, have higher yields without having some of the negative impacts that we hear about with respect to water quality runoff, for instance. So with that, I think I'll pass it back over to you, Roger, but thanks again.
Great. Thank you very much, David. Very good point on actionable information. Well, please join me in thanking the panel. This was really an engaging discussion.